Okay. All right, class. So, tell you what. So you guys are watching this. I'm recording this on Wednesday afternoon, and you're either watching this later on this evening, Wednesday evening, or perhaps tomorrow. So my directive to you guys that you will have that I'm going to be sending out via the email system will be for you to watch this prior to our class on Friday, September 11th. And the assumption right now, at least, is that we will be back on campus together in the Psalm Center, except for a few of you who are of course Zooming in. But the vast majority of us will be together again on Friday in the Psalm Center at 2 p.m. That is our hope, at least right now. If things change, know that I will be messaging you through the Populi email link that I get to send out. So I hope you're well. I know there are some who are probably in the midst of all this chaos trying to, either evacuate themselves or perhaps help someone else do the same and evacuate due to the wildfires. So I guess this is a, master of the obvious statement, but just remember to be praying for one another and for God's grace and protection during the midst of all this chaos. So if a global pandemic isn't enough and murder hornets aren't enough and whatnot and so forth, and all the cultural chaos with, the George Floyd incident, the more recent incident in Kenosha. We have here in the Pacific Northwest, we have these wildfires. So, I had a guy I interacted with earlier today. He said that 2020 was conspiring to kill us all. Obviously, I don't know that I would quite put things that way, but I understand the sentiment. So, you guys hang in there. I hope you're getting through this, and we'll hopefully reconnect with each other in person on Friday. So, and by the way, so you guys, never mind, you guys don't have a rotation schedule. So for all my other classes, I have to keep them on track with which rotations showing up on Friday, but thankfully we don't have to deal with that in this particular class. So I will try to keep you guys squared away as far as assignments. If something does happen, by the way, again, I will contact you. So just a reminder that because the Populi system links us to you guys, it allows us to communicate to you primarily. It's easiest through the email system. We can send one message that automatically goes out to all of you in our registered classes. So just make sure that you are remaining apprised of the situation for Corbin vis-a-vis your Corbin email and things like that, okay? And we'll just kind of go from there. So guys and gals, here's what we did. I left off the other day and we were talking about the pilgrims and the arrival. And my goal here is to establish some basics about Puritan societies that were being put together, that were arriving and promulgating in North America in the early part of the 17th century. And although there are some variations between the group that we call the Pilgrims that arrived in 1620 and the later group that migrated from England to what is now Massachusetts beginning in 1630, okay, 10 years later, their theology, their dedication to Calvinist principles would certainly, and some of their other behavioral patterns would certainly bring them very close together, which is why they're often grouped by many scholars into this umbrella that we call Puritanism, this theological or philosophical umbrella that we call Puritanism. So the Puritans of Massachusetts Bay is where we're going to get to in a minute, but I haven't finished with the Plymouth colony that arrived in 1620. And there are a couple of leaders that um, that probably deserve mentioning, but the one that I'm certainly going to focus in on is William Bradford, because I think he's the crucial guy. And you know, we have the interesting story of the crossing, right? It takes much longer than what they originally planned. They did not arrive at the location that they desired, so it was also later in the year, a very forbidding environment at that time of year in, you know, eastern Massachusetts, right there on the ocean, a very unforgiving environment, especially during the winter months. So not only was the journey difficult, upon arrival, the establishment of this colony becomes a very challenging reality indeed. So we have the some maps here. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on the initial encounters and movements of this group of pilgrims, but we do need to talk about some of the challenges that they faced. So before they even disembark from the Mayflower, right, there's famously this decision on the part of Bradford and others to draw up some sort of an agreement. It becomes known, of course, as the Mayflower Compact. And this is often, you know, it's regarded as one of the earliest forms of a charter in this part of the world. I think that, you know, I understand the intention there, but the reality is that there had been previous explorations, pretty extensive ones, and I don't know if we want to label this as some sort of a pioneering movement as far as a charter. Nonetheless, the principles of a community that is dedicated to one another, establishing principles of authority, establishing some basic concepts regarding rule of law. This is an essential component. So before they even disembark, they've already done this. There were some other restrictions and codes drawn up after they are on shore and formulating their colony. So it's not all done on board, but the primary elements were drawn up before they even stepped foot on land. So the first year is this very, you know, almost a surreal, I would imagine, a surreal, challenging, you can throw in a couple of other descriptives here, catastrophic would probably come to mind. The death toll for the Mayflower Pilgrims from the fall of 1620 to the next year to 1621 is pretty stunning. And this has to have had the biggest impact in many respects. Obviously, the physical loss is the critical component, but also I don't want to dismiss the psychological impact, the impact on morale that the loss of so many pilgrims had to take. And so we're dealing with nearly, you know, almost numerically, almost exactly 2/3 of the original members who set out from England in 1620. By the time we get to the next fall, they have been dropping like flies. And primarily this was happening during that initial winter where they were running out of food resources. They did get some help from some of the indigenous groups that were nearby, an assortment of derivative of the Narragansett people are there to help them through parts of the winter and supply them with much needed food resources. And in the following spring, they are shown what kinds of things grow well, what kinds of crops can be planted and grown. So the recovery process the next summer and fall is significant, but that first year in particular was just catastrophic for this group. Almost didn't survive. So we talk about the Pilgrims, And this is one of the more crucial elements, which brings me to an association I want you to have. So, look, the reality is this. I'm not going to dig into this too deeply. I realize that there are some absolutely phenomenal public school teachers in our country, and thankfully they're there. And I mean, I know a few myself. I have some friends around this country in about 17 different states, actually, who are public school teachers, and I think they're pretty awesome. I will say that the curriculum that they are forced to use when it comes to the topic of American history is very limiting at best, and maybe convoluted would be another word I would use. And sometimes it is just straight up a postmodern, like pseudo-Marxist approach to American history that I find very disappointing. One of the things that I've seen is a lot of students coming into Corbin with some very strange associations with a number of key events. And this one is just one I'll mention in passing. The idea that the first Thanksgiving, first of all, oftentimes there's a very confused association with what this was. But secondly, even if there's an association with the first Thanksgiving, it's a wrong one. So the first Thanksgiving takes place the following autumn, and we don't have a date, but we do know that it happened, that there was a celebration, a worshipful celebration that Bradford writes about in the Plymouth Colony, whereby in the following year, 1621, this group gathers together, the remnants that are there, those who remain after the starving time and that horrific first 7 or 8 months in the New World. They're still alive, they've made it through, and they gather for, after the harvest has taken place and the crops have come to fruition and they have been harvested and there's food and there is bounty available to them, and it looks like they may in fact have a very strong chance of survival in this new colony. They gather together to give thanks. And here's the deal. I don't know why this is such a confusing orientation for our public school curriculum. They did not gather together to thank the natives who assisted them during that first year. Although it is important to note, and Bradford is very specific about this, that more than a dozen and a half, almost 15 or 16 of the natives who had been most instrumental in helping them weather the storm of that first year, they were invited and welcomed into this collection to gather and eat and be thankful together. But this was not about giving thanks to the natives, as welcome as they may have been. This was about giving thanks to God for his provision, seeing them through that first year. And when Thanksgiving during the late 19th century, when Thanksgiving receives a much more formal notation in our calendar year, this was the designation, the recognition that the pilgrims who survived were gathering for this particular reason. Now, the Plymouth Colony. If you've ever been out there, obviously these are not original structures. These, if you go there, there's a reconstructed version, right, of the Plymouth Colony of the 17th century. And so it's there for you to at least have an idea of the kinds of structures that they built and that they were living in. And I think it's a good introduction to colonial life. So here's what I want to do. So you've got a good idea. This slide shows you've got Plymouth Colony, 1620 to 1691 is what it's showing here. So the Plymouth Colony is actually to the south of what becomes known as the Massachusetts Bay Colony, both of which exist in modern day Massachusetts. So you see here on the map the geographic location or the relationship between the two. I want to talk about the Massachusetts Bay Colony and then make some general commentaries regarding, Puritan societies as they functioned in the 17th century. So the other colony, the colony that exists to the north of the Plymouth colony where the Pilgrims established their particular group. The other colony is obviously known as Massachusetts Bay. And these are often, I mean, if we want to talk about Puritanism, this group would be the more conventional, more orthodox group of Puritans. So their belief system is far more easily traced directly to the whole notion of Puritanism. And there's this essential migration, as you see in the slide here, that begins technically in 1629, but I mean, I'm going to say just circa, meaning the general time frame, from around 1630 to 1640 or so. And a number of Puritans are exiting England primarily due to a lot of the abuse that they'd received at the hand of a succession of monarchs, and the fact that Anglicanism was not something they wanted to maintain in their religious belief system. So you see that the Great Puritan Migration occurs during this time slot. And I want you to note that many of them did, of course, come to New England. There were a few that went a little bit further south to Maryland and Virginia, to the Chesapeake Bay colonies. And then there were even those that migrated directly south to the Caribbean. And so not all of them came to New England. Now, you see that the numbers for New England are around 20,000. It's actually more like 23,000, I think. To the West Indies, it's actually just a touch shade under 20,000, I think 19,000 or thereabouts. So the majority did go to New England, but the dispersal patterns indicate here that they also went to other parts of the world. So just a quick association. Again, what I told you the other day, I think you should have this in your heads. It's a pretty easy one. To the Puritans, they wanted to purify the church from within. All right. So this is the idea. So this group these are not separatists as the Pilgrims were. The Pilgrims just wanted nothing to do with the church. The Puritan theology says, look, the church has all sorts of flaws. We want to exist in a community that doesn't throw off every doctrine and every theological principle, but tries to bring it back to its original purified form. So that's an essential component for us. Governor Winthrop, one of the crucial characters, John Winthrop. And the really neat thing about Winthrop is that many of his writings survive, and his documentation as the governor of policies and procedures and lifestyle requirements of this group, they're pretty much documented in detail. Winthrop. So I have you guys, one of the things that is assigned with the reading is, as you go through the primary source documents in the American Yawp text, you have access to one of the famous sermons, one of the famous pieces by Winthrop, and it references this idea of a city upon a hill. The city upon a hill doctrine is often what is referenced here. And I want to just mention this now, even though I'll probably come back to it when we get to Americans in the 19th century referencing something like Manifest Destiny. There are those who already reference back to Winthrop and this whole concept of a city upon a hill. So in the modern mindset, the idea of a city upon a hill has, I think, been misrepresented. At least what has been misrepresented regarding Winthrop's intentions is the key that I want to address. So what was Winthrop saying? In modern America, the idea has existed, continues to exist in some circles, that the United States is this beacon to the rest of the world, but not just a beacon, that the United States has this right, is this responsibility to forcibly alter uh, other parts of the world that have fallen behind and are not engaging in the construction of civilization properly, that they are not engaging in enlightened behavior, and therefore they need correction. Thankfully, I think the list of individuals, the list of people who think like that, I think they're decreasing in some ways, but it's still a prominent enough in American culture to deserve mention. But what I will say is this: that is not what John Winthrop was promoting. So Winthrop, when he references the biblical references in the New Testament, when he's talking about the city upon a hill, he's arguing, he's making an argument for his new fellow colonists, and he's saying, you know, what are we doing here essentially? What is our purpose here? And his argument is basically this: you know, if we're really doing this right, if we're engaging in our service to one another and to God in a correct way, our goal should be to inspire, not to alter by force of arms, not to force others to change the way they think and act, and to force them to take on our way of life physically. So not to go in there and make that happen. So not to travel to other colonies or to other parts of the globe and forcibly make people structure their society like Massachusetts Bay. That is not what Winthrop foresees. That is not what Winthrop believes is the goal of his particular colony. He does believe that if they're behaving rightly, and if they are engaging prayerfully in their thoughts and actions, and if they are reflecting Christ as they ought, that they can inspire others, essentially. So when he talks about a beacon, it's this beacon of light, right, that is going to shine upon others and maybe inspire them to consider the possibility that what the Massachusetts Bay colonists have constructed and the things that they think and the ways that they live are actually very valuable applications of human life. That's essentially what Winthrop is saying with the city upon a hill statement. Regardless of what others have said or how they have misused, misapplied what Winthrop says, that is his original intention. And I think it's important that we note that. So the way I want to end this portion is to talk briefly about our notions of Puritanism. So the idea has often been that these Puritans, whether we're talking about the Plymouth colony or the Massachusetts Bay colony, that the Puritans of the 17th century were these, based on pictures like this, right? The way that they dressed, the dour looks on their faces, they seem to be highly serious, incapable of fun. Some have remarked that there are those, when we talk about Puritanism, who've fallen into a very careless definition of them, suggesting that all Puritans were sexually repressed and they couldn't, they couldn't understand and behave like adults when it came to human sexuality. And I think these are, especially if we consider the, all of the information we do have and all the diaries that we do have that we can read through, and we can begin to understand these people as human beings rather as caricatures. I think we begin to see something very different with the Puritans. They certainly did have the Calvinist work ethic. They had these expectations in their society that we would regard as rather limiting, I'm sure. But it's a reminder that in the 21st century, it's probably best to not broadcast our present realities and expectations of life back into time and connect them to people who never would have had the same orientations. So, what you find the more you dig into Puritan society is hard workers. They could be stern, right? They could be serious about what they had to get done. Their expectations in this communal format were not just for themselves, but they had work expectations and also spiritual expectations for others in their colony. It functioned like, it is to a degree functioning like a theocracy, right? So the goal is to be Christ-like and to be good Christian human beings, to serve God in rightful and meaningful ways. So their Christian belief system is at the heart and core of colonial life. Especially early on, this is a clear-cut requirement. But to think that they weren't capable of having fun doesn't seem to make sense. There are plenty of diary entries that we have where the discussion of the life in the pub, for instance, and all sorts of jokes being made, and the games that they gathered to play, especially if it was a day of relaxation and fun. They did have those festivals. They did have them pretty frequently throughout the course of the year. These people were not opposed to having fun. They just chose to limit their fun to specific times and places. And regarding this whole notion of sexual repression, the idea that the Puritans were incapable of talking about their sex lives is actually just outlandish. I mean, you don't have to delve in very deeply to these diaries between husbands and wives to realize they aren't shying away at all from talking about their relationship in their loving relationship in a number of different ways, including the sexual component of their marriage relationship. Obviously, a sexual relationship in marriage was incumbent upon these Puritan people. You are not going to be living lives in which you were engaging in sexual intercourse outside the bonds of marriage. At least that was the expectation. So, you read through these and you realize, goodness sakes, they're not being, they're certainly not pulling any punches here. They're being very clear with how much, if a husband travels to another colony and he's gone for a week or 2 weeks or however long it may be, and he receives a letter from his wife, telling him to hurry on home, it's not just because she misses his company in a social sense. She's also can't wait for him to come back home for the other obvious reasons. The sexual references are pretty clear in these kinds of Puritan documents. So I want you to be aware that when we talk about Puritanism, it's really easy to get these cliches in our minds, and I think we need to work harder and to view them as normal human beings of their time who happen to be devoted to these religious principles. Now, it is true that over time, Puritan societies in, whether it's Massachusetts Bay or the Plymouth Colony, they came under increasing pressure to change. And this is because the longer the distance from their original founding period till the end of the century in the 1680s and 90s, you see that newer generations of Puritans, it was harder sometimes to convince them that they should abide by, the work requirements and, these spiritual zeal that they had, that their parents and grandparents and so forth had been requiring of themselves. And so, as with any society, generationally, you're going to have some stretches and challenges. And that certainly happened with the Puritans. So the closer we get to 1700 and moving forward, you would have seen some pressure to soften the expectations when it came to whether it came to their civic responsibilities, whether it came to their specific work responsibilities in the community, or whether it came to doctrine. And there are some famous right? Some famous brouhahas that come to the forefront. Probably the most famous, of course, would be the witch trials, the Salem witch trials, that the Crucible deals with. Very very important Arthur Miller play, brought to the forefront through film. So yeah, these are interesting realities of Puritan life. But as I said just a second ago, I think it's really helpful for us to try to humanize this group of people instead of rely on kind of the pop culture iconic versions of the Puritans. Okay, now I want to move forward and talk about mercantilism in relation to something very important for us, and that's the slave trade. So a couple of things. So this is going to be, so this is about the late 17th and into the 18th centuries here. We're seeing the institution of slavery begin to expand in North America in these colonies that are popping up there. And obviously throughout the semester, one of the things that we're going to be doing is trying to contextualize and understand the roots of slavery and the realities of slavery in North America. What becomes a system of chattel or skin-based ownership slavery. So we'll talk about chattel slavery a couple different times throughout the semester. But my goal here today is to try to do some framing that helps you to understand how people rationalized this. And I want you to understand that there occasionally have been a student or two, there's occasionally been a student or two that misunderstands what I'm doing here. This is not my rationalization of this system. This is an attempt as a historian to frame some things for you guys that help you to understand how a system, how an abomination like this, like ownership of other human beings, selling and buying human beings, the same as one might sell or buy cattle, how a system like that was allowed in this part of the world in relatively recent times when it comes to human history. Hadn't we learned the evils of slavery going back to the Egyptians and the Sumerians, or even the Greeks and Romans, and beyond into European civilization? Even in the African peoples who were enslaving one another prior to the interference of Europeans who came in and capitalized on the slave trade that already existed in many parts of Africa. We can even talk about the slave systems in East Asia, for instance. So this has been a global pandemic when it comes to human civilization. How does this get started? How is it perpetuated in this part of the world at this time? Well, to understand that, we have to base this in the mercantile system. So mercantilism is an economic concept of nations. So it is not something that simply exists at a very small personal level, although that would technically be true. It is probably best understood as part of an international economic order. And I guess the best way to explain mercantilism, by the way, you guys have an outline for this that I posted in Populi, so you should be able to access that. So that's what I'm going on right now. Mercantilism and the slave trade, that's the outline we're using. So mercantilism essentially says that there are finite resources in the world, which is to say there are limited amounts of resources in the world. And what that means is that there are, in order to capitalize on those limited resources, that there's going to be competition. So the idea becomes that the various imperial nations, the nations who have colonies that are competing with one another, if they're going to take advantage and if they're going to expand their power around the globe, then they must be successful in the seizing of those commodities, of those global resources. They must do their best to kind of, triangulate and monopolize as many resources as they possibly can. So the whole idea of mercantilism is that in this global competition for these resources, nations are going to have to do their very best to, cut to the chase quickly and beat out their opposition, beat out their competitors. In this case, their competitors are other countries. So especially the imperial powers of the 18th century, for instance. So France and Britain being primary among them, I would say. They're joined later on in the late 18th and 19th centuries by Prussia, what becomes ultimately the modern German state. But of course, Spain, Portugal, and some of these other powers are joining in the mix. Our focal point will be France and Britain because both of these countries end up competing with each other specifically for expanding, specifically for the purpose of expanding their respective power in North America. So, this slide here that you see on the screen, you see there's this kind of this triangular relationship. So what it means is that in this mercantile system, you find natural resources, right? When those natural resources are found, they are filtered or sent back to be processed from raw materials into completed or manufactured goods. Once that is done, once they have been turned into, if you're talking about tobacco, indigo, flour, lumber, whatever it is, right? So once those elements have been processed and turned from their raw form into something that is sellable, right, marketable, then they are sent around the world, right? They're marketed and sent around the world as commodities to be purchased. So in this system, or within this system, slaves were viewed in the 18th, 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, right, for this long period of time, up until the end of the slave trade in Britain, which happens in the first decade of the 19th century in the British Islands anyway, the British Isles. For us, of course, the abolition of the slave trade in the United States comes much later in that century, but it does come in the 19th century. So prior to that point, the slave trade and the slave system is viewed to be a critical component of this international economy. The idea being that a slave workforce is going to allow you as an imperial power to become more profitable by comparison. Now, to be honest with you, just from an economic perspective for the moment, there are a number of questions with that scenario, especially because of the immense costs, right? So again, just approaching this through the lens of imperial economics, there were theorists that put this question to the forefront even back then, questioned the efficacy of relying on a slave labor force, which itself costs quite a bit of money to maintain. Even though you were not paying them a wage, it costs money to maintain, slave housing, slave clothing, feeding, nourishing, et cetera, et cetera. And so there were questions about all of this. But for the most part, the determination was, of course, that this was actually a profitable enterprise. So you need to understand that the whole concept of slavery in the West, by the time we get to the 1700s and moving forward, that this concept is entirely steeped within the concept of mercantilism. Now, it would be pretty callous and cold for us to just talk about the rationales, the economic rationales that were used. And by the way, we're going to come back. One of my main focal points when we dig into the realities of slavery in antebellum American society, we're going to talk about the other kinds of rationales for chattel slavery, particularly in the American South. So this is not our only discussion of this. It's an important topic we're going to be revisiting several times. But I do want you to understand some critical components of this. First and foremost, it is important for you to understand that African kingdoms enslaved one another for centuries, many centuries before Europeans came in and kind of took over portions of the enslavement process and actually began to relocate them much further afield. So this is not an invention. This is a continuation of abominable human behavior. The primary locations for slave traders to take Africans from homeland territory to other parts of the world centered, as far as we're going to talk about here, it's centered on the western coast of Africa, various African nations along the western coast. And there are some that become the focal points, right? So the Gold Coast, the Slave Coast, as it's sometimes referenced here, you see on the map. So there are particular locations that seem to be particular centers of this. But what happens is the Europeans actually, the red arrows on this slide help to indicate this. The slavers had come to the port cities and they would rely on African people to go into the interior and trap and enslave fellow Africans, typically those from rival kingdoms, and bring them out to these coastal cities, at which point the European traders would take them off their hands and begin the transportation process. And this is known as the Middle Passage, and I'll get to that in a minute. Over the course of this era that we're covering in American history this semester, so from the late 17th century on through the mid 19th century, we're dealing with untold millions in some respects. So here's the problem. The record keeping is sometimes was sometimes shoddy on this. So we have some variation. Conservative estimates, okay? So conservative estimates of the slave transportation from the west coast of Africa to the Caribbean and parts of North America place this at conservatively around 19 million plus African people taken from the western part of the continent. Those are conservative estimates. There are some that put it well over 20. Regardless, we're dealing with a human catastrophe. Not only are we going to talk about the human catastrophe experienced by these African people who were enslaved, so the human atrocity, the human experience, keep in mind that it also is catastrophic for the African societies that are in existence, right? When you lose that many of your kingdom, that many young men, women, whoever's taken, when you lose that many people from your kingdom, it is catastrophic for you and your people and for your, your economy, however your economy is based. It is disastrous. It is disastrous from a human perspective, just the loss of those people from your life, the loss of those people from your family, from your kingdom overall, friends, neighbors, loved ones, never to be seen again. But obviously, it's the tragic realities of being enslaved that just, they wash over you, and it's hard to maintain your emotional state properly because of because of the highly disturbing realities that we read. Which brings me to the middle passage. Now, there's an account in the American Yawp text, reference point to Alauda Equiano's experience, one of the more famous slave narratives. I would highly recommend the entire narrative. It's pretty long. I assign it in some of my upper division history classes, but it's moving. It's horrific. There are times when it's just inspirational. Alauda Equiano was just a phenomenal human being. Ended up taking part in the push to eliminate the slave trade in Great Britain. So one of the inspirations for that cause. But his recitation in his slave narrative walks the reader through the realities of this, even the transportation process across the ocean. And you can see here, we've got slave vessels outlined here, the depiction of them. And you can see how these African people were transported across the sea. They were laid on their backs. Initially, they were forced to lie on their sides to make more room. That actually caused all sorts of physical agony, and many of the initial slaves that were being transported all the way back in the 17th century, many of them didn't survive the trip. So slavers understood, even as they devalued these people, they did come to understand that they had to be treated at least a little better, or they wouldn't even make the trip. But make no mistake, these conditions were just catastrophic and horrible. Lying below decks for most of every day. If the slave captain of a particular ship was considered somewhat benevolent, he might let the slaves walk around on deck for a brief time before they were, hustled back down below. You can imagine, these people in the heat of, the South Atlantic, especially when they approached the Caribbean and on up through the Southern American colonies. You can imagine how horrific that heat would have made this situation, and the defecation, the urination, in these holds. It has to have just been horrific just to experience that. The reality of being sold into slavery, the psychological realities seem to set in, of course, as well, and this is a major problem. There are stories of slaves who were allowed up on deck for brief periods of time, and they knowingly jumped into shark-infested waters and were killed, and believed that to be a better fate than arriving in the New World and being thrown into, the slavery plantations. The sugar plantations in places like Barbados in particular were brutal. So these realities are just demoralizing to contend with, but they're essential for us to understand as we try to factor in both the socioeconomic systems that allowed for this to happen, but also as we try very hard to not lose sight of the human realities. We have to humanize these events as much as we possibly can, so that we're not losing sight of, our moral bearings, really. So this system, this slide here is a representation. This system is in place by the late 17th century on through the mid 19th century in the States. And you can see the different points of reference for us as we're talking about, you know, the Bahamas, the British colonies along the eastern seaboard. You can see where many of these slaves are being taken. The slave systems in the southern states, the southern colonies, not the states, the southern colonies at this point, more prominent because of the tobacco plantations that exist. The sugar plantations in the Caribbean are particularly important for you to note. And I mention this because when we talk about Great Britain's entire export economy, the sugar plantations in the Caribbean, and think about this through a global scale. So, right, if we're talking about Britain circa 17, we'll say 1750 or thereabouts. So if we're talking about Britain by the time we get to the early 1700s or the mid 1700s, of Britain's entire global export economy, the sugar plantations represented nearly a fifth. Some estimators say it's even higher, so at least a fifth, maybe is a better way to put it, a fifth of Britain's entire export economy on a global scale, which means that this is a highly valued enterprise. So of course they poured slaves into these sugar plantations in the Caribbean. That was where the vast majority went. A comparatively small number of slaves from West Africa were transported to British colonies along the eastern seaboard. And it's primarily because there just wasn't nearly as much of a need in the British mercantile system. The largest need in those colonies was, as I said, on those tobacco plantations in places like Virginia, for instance. So that's the set piece really for us as we try to understand this system. All right, guys, that's where I'm going to stop today. So my goal is that on Friday, we're going to reconnect, and the vast majority of us will be together back in the Psalm Center. As I said, obviously, if that changes, if we continue to have real problems with the smoke factor or whatever else it may be with the wildfires, then obviously I'll be in communication with you. But please, please take care of yourselves. Be careful, be smart, be as safe as you can, and obviously keep up with your academic work. You have to make sure that you're not dropping behind. So thank you so much for watching this. I hope it's brought you back up to speed, and have a good rest of your evening, or I'm not sure when you're going to watch this. So have a good rest of your evening, or if you're watching this tomorrow, which is Thursday, have a good Thursday, and I will see you on Friday. All right. See ya.